Well, hi there again. Social Studies 30-1. We're still in Chapter 11, and what we're going to take a look at today is the American Civil Rights Movement. Again, Chapter 11 is our examination of illiberalism, which once again is governments taking undemocratic action in a democracy. Governments taking away rights and freedoms for some people in a democracy, um, with the rationale, the justification being we're doing this for the betterment of the greater good. We're doing this for the betterment of society as a whole. So we're going to take away some people's rights and freedoms to protect the greater good. Now, whether or not that is true, well, I mean, who knows? Every case is on an individual basis. And you're welcome to evaluate them and decide whether or not those actions were or are justifiable. That is completely your call. That is the whole point of this course. Examples we've looked at have been the War Measures Act in Canada, in which we interned Ukrainian Canadians, the Japanese Canadians, dealing with the FLQ crisis. Um, we looked at anti-terrorist legislation in Canada and the U.S. under the Patriot Act. We've looked at individual instances of illiberalism, um, uh, Qatar, etc., Guantanamo Bay. What we're going to look at now is a bigger example of illiberalism in action. In this case, in the southern states of the United States of America. Most people are aware of the civil rights movement. They know bits and pieces of it, but they don't really know the full story. And by no means can I give you the full story in our time together, but I can give you a better idea of where the movement came from, what made it necessary, and did they get what they wanted in the end. So this will take a couple of days. I'm going to teach you a few things today. You're actually going to watch a documentary over a couple of classes over the next 2 days as well to really understand and appreciate the American Civil Rights Movement. I think the first thing you want to understand and be aware of is that the civil rights movement is not the act of illiberalism. Um, it was what was necessary to overcome previous acts of illiberalism. So, as you're going to learn, in the American South, a lot of things, well, practically everything was segregated. There were separate schools, separate drinking fountains, separate restaurants, and so on. So everything was segregated by and large in the American South. There was a school for black kids, there was a school for white kids. There was a white drinking fountain, there was a black drinking fountain. Um, Black people sat at the back of the bus, white people sat at the front of the bus. That's what I mean by desegregation. So those desegregation laws were the examples of illiberalism that we're looking at. The civil rights movement was the way they overcame those laws and finally brought about political and economic equality rights for black people in the American South. So I hope you understand that difference. So on your screen, you should see the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, a statue depicting a police officer with a German Shepherd on a leash, a chain, uh, holding back a young black man. Um, that scene would have been very typical in a lot of the American South in the 50s and 60s. German shepherds were used, water cannons were used to keep the movement at bay, to try and halt the civil rights movement in its tracks. Of course, it didn't work, but scenes like this would have been very typical back then. And it's actually quite a violent scene when I look at it. I mean, it's terrifying. Um, Police officer standing down a young black man, and the German Shepherd is ready to bite and attack the kid as well. I mean, that would take a lot of courage and bravery to stand there in the face of what was coming at him. I have to admire the people that went through this. More images, and then you can see why the monument is depicted the way it is in Birmingham, Alabama. German Shepherds were a common tactic of law enforcement agencies to keep people at bay, to stop them. And on the right, you can see the picture of the water cannon. That would really hurt. That water is very pressurized. I mean, it's not like playing with your garden hose in the backyard. That would hurt. Um, that would discombobulate you, disorient you. They're trying to use bully tactics to quell the black civil rights movement. All right, so there's some information on the movement itself. Definition: it was a mass protest movement against racial segregation and discrimination in the southern states. This came to national prominence, the national forefront, in the mid 1950s. So when something comes to prominence, it doesn't mean that it's being seen for the first time. It just means that it's kind of on a national level being observed for the first time. So mid 1950s, it came to the forefront in America. The reasons for the roots would be in the slave trade. As you know, the southern states conducted the American slave trade. They captured black people from the west coast of Africa, transported them across the Atlantic, and sold them as slaves in the American southern states. Uh, by and large, the American South, their economy was based on the extraction of resources. So giant cotton plantations, corn, sugar plantations, and so on. And so these economies were based very much on the extraction of raw resources, which meant you needed a really large labor force to actually extract these resources. So to grow crops, to harvest crops, to pick cotton and things like that. And having a giant slave labor force would be a very cheap way for the owners of these plantations and farms to make money. I mean, after all, the cheaper you can pay your labor, the more money you pocket as a farm owner or as a factory owner. And that's exactly what's going on here. This giant slave labor force that is working for free, meaning more profit for the owners of these plantations and so on. And you've probably seen that in movies. Django Unchained is set in the American South, and there's a plantation depicted in that. Now, I'm not saying that movie is factual. I'm just saying that that is an example of these giant plantations that we're talking about. There also would have had to have gone along with this widespread ethnocentrism and discrimination and prejudiced feelings. So, in other words, the owners, the American South, the owners of these plantations and so on, would have completely dehumanized black people from the beginning to rationalize buying and selling them as slaves, and in some cases working them to death as slaves. And we've all seen the punishment that they would have dished out to slaves at that time. So to make all this possible, to allow for a slave trade, you would need deep-seated feelings of racial hatred, of racial disintegration between white people and black people. And so those feelings kind of never really went away completely in a lot of the American South. They're still there today. I mean, after all, there are the occasional clashes between white supremacists and law enforcement in the American South. So the feelings never really went away completely. And that's going to be important when we come back and talk about this later. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and it was a war between the American North and the American South. It was a war over the slave trade. The North wanted to abolish it. They found it horrifying it was going on. And the South said, fine, if you're going to abolish slavery, we're going to secede. We're going to break away from the states and form our own sovereign country of the South and keep the slave trade. So the two sides went to war. The North eventually defeats the South and, you know, tries to legally eradicate the slave trade. And so, even though at the end of the Civil War in 1865, on paper, um, the American slaves had been freed from their bondage and slavery, it's one thing to have it on paper, it's another thing to put it into action. It was never really put into action like they'd hoped. And what I'm trying to say is that even though on paper the American slaves had been freed, they still didn't have a lot of the political and economic rights that other Americans did. Biggest example, they still couldn't vote. Um, States in America have a lot of power over their actual states. So yeah, there's a federal government, but the southern states have a lot of power. They yield a lot of power, and they don't need to make those things happen. So even though the federal level of government said black people get to vote, It didn't always happen in these southern states. A lot of obstacles were put in the way of black people to stop them from voting. Things like having to pay a toll to vote that was unaffordable, having to take a test or pass a quiz that no one could pass anyway before they could vote. A lot of things got in the way to prevent black people from voting. And so, to try and attain these civil rights, these political rights, a lot of people resorted to nonviolent protest beginning in the 1950s and the 1960s. They're trying to break out of that pattern of segregation by race. There will be uh, some examples of federal legislation that's going to make it happen that you'll learn about when you watch the documentary. And while a lot of people use the form of nonviolent protest, there will be militant protest, violent protest that we're going to examine in our lesson as well. So I know that took a long time. You needed a bit of the backstory. You needed some background about the slave trade, the Civil War, before you can appreciate the things that happen next. When I refer to the slave states, we're talking about the southern states. So the ones in red on the screen would be the states that we're talking about, so probably the heart of the slave trade. When we think of slavery in America, um, states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia would probably be the ones that come to mind first, but there is more. Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, Virginia, the two Carolinas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas were also involved in the slave trade too. And so the Civil War was the North, the states that wanted to abolish slavery, against the South, the ones that were fighting to keep slavery. And as we learned, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and the North eventually wins the Civil War. But that doesn't mean that was the end of all of those feelings of ethnocentrism and discrimination toward black people in the American South. They never completely went away. You've probably seen that picture before, or at least that person before. That is Martin Luther King Jr. Many would call him the leader of the Black Civil Rights Movement. There's some information on Martin Luther King Jr. Was actually assassinated in 1968. He was the driving force behind a lot of the civil rights events, like the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, which we will be learning over the next few days. Actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his efforts, and they recognize Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a U.S. federal holiday every day since 1986. A common photograph from that time. Not sure if you've ever heard of Rosa Parks. We'll talk about Rosa Parks as another example of the American civil rights movement. So it wasn't just one event that sums up and typifies the American civil rights movement. There's a series of events that we need to understand and appreciate. As I mentioned, one of the segregation laws in the American South was um, the situation where white people sat at the front of the bus and black people sat at the back of the bus. Rosa Parks in 1955 defied the law and sat at the front, which was, I guess, a big deal at that time. She was told to give up her seat and move to the back. She refused and was eventually arrested because she wouldn't give up her seat. She was also uh, fired from her job because she participated in what became known as the Montgomery bus boycott, which eventually led to the integration and the desegregation of public transportation in Montgomery. But Rosa Parks was arrested and she did lose her job for participating in the boycott, but is very inspirational to the movement. I'm sure we'd all agree. Famous photo of Rosa Parks sitting at the front of the bus. And as I said, she was arrested. That was a form of what we call nonviolent protest. You're just standing there, you're just sitting there, you're not wrecking things, you're not resorting to violence. And if they go ahead and arrest you, it makes people perhaps more sympathetic to you, and it makes the government and the law enforcement agencies look bad. They look like the aggressor. I mean, all you're doing is standing there or sitting there, and then they come along and arrest you. It's a good way to garner sympathy from the public. You weren't really doing anything wrong, but they still arrested you. Little Rock Nine, not sure if you've heard of the Little Rock Nine. They were a group of nine black students who enrolled at what used to be an all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. So what had happened is by this point, the Supreme Court in 1954 had passed a law that desegregated public schools. They decided that segregation of schools based on race was unconstitutional. So this was as of 1954. And so in 1957, the Little Rock Nine attempted to enroll at what used to be the all-white high school, and the governor actually sent in the National Guard to block the kids from getting into the school. Later on that month, federal troops were actually sent to escort the kids into the school, and it got a lot of attention nationwide. It was on the news, it was in the newspapers, and just brought the civil rights movement again to the forefront in America. Put it in the news, put it in the paper. You've probably heard of the Little Rock Nine before, and that's what that event is about. There's a famous photo of one of the Little Rock Nine trying to go into school. Look at the rage of the people behind her. Look at the courage it would have taken for her to do that, to walk through that crowd, to attend school. Um, I look at the photograph and especially the woman behind her. I find like how can you be so angry about something like that? Like it shows you how deep seated those feelings were in the American South. And if you look close, you can see a couple of guards in the background. I mean, that's the only way they were going to get into the school was with the National Guard escort. Stand in the schoolhouse door. This was later on in 1963. This was in Alabama in this case. What had happened was two African American students had successfully enrolled at the university, and they were going in to try and register for classes and pay their fees. And the governor of Alabama, uh, Governor Wallace, stood literally in the schoolhouse door. You can see it in the picture down here, and wouldn't allow them to come into the building. Stand in the schoolhouse door. Wallace had promised segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so, to make good on his words, he stood in the schoolhouse door to ban them from entering. But eventually, Kennedy sent in the National Guard troops again to the university to enforce the desegregation of that school. And so, in the end, the kids did get to go in, and they got to attend the University of Alabama. Another good example of the American Civil Rights Movement. There's a photograph of them finally getting in. Jackson Woolworths sit-in on May 28, 1963. Small group of students and faculty teachers from a nearby college in North Jackson drove to the lunch counter at a local Woolworths store near the governor's mansion. Now, at this time, Woolworths was kind of a department store, and there was also a little sit-in restaurant too. Now, at this time, um, the dining facilities were very strictly segregated. And so the fact that these black students were sitting in um, the white sitting area, white mob arrived, and some of the kids were beaten up. One was knocked unconscious, and then others were doused with ketchup, mustard, and sugar for quite some time during the Jackson Woolworth sit-in. I don't know if we have department stores that also have restaurants today. I'm not sure if we do, but back then they did, and that's what happened. They sat in the segregated area and then suffered abuse for the next while as they sat there promoting the civil rights movement. Here's a picture I always find very disturbing. I mean, all they're doing is sitting there, um, and they're suffering abuse from the white mob. Um, Stuff's being dumped on their heads, and sugar, mustard, ketchup, anything they could do to humiliate them, they did. And some were beaten up. One was knocked unconscious, and all they were doing was sitting there. Again, non-violent protest. It's risky, it's dangerous, but it can be very effective. There's a different photo. This one I appreciate as well because it shows you the scale of the mob that was against them being there in the first place. It's not just two or three people hurling insults at them. It's a lot of people hurling insults and abuse at them. I just admire the courage and conviction of them sitting there and doing that for what they believed in. We should talk a bit about the Jim Crow laws. Now, these are the illiberal laws. This is the heart of illiberalism in the American South, what are known as the Jim Crow laws. These were the segregation laws. These were the disenfranchisement laws. To be disenfranchised means you can't vote. You're not an equal citizen. You don't have the rights and freedoms that other people would enjoy because of disenfranchised laws, just disenfranchisement laws. They're called Jim Crow laws. I had done some reading. The original Jim Crow was a cartoon character that poked fun at black people, and so I don't know how or why it happened, but they evolved into the Jim Crow laws, and they represented a formal legal codified system of racial apartheid. Apartheid is when you have kind of like a caste system where some people are born into a better lot in life than others, and it's based on race. And this dominated the American South for quite some time. And as it says, the laws affected almost every aspect of your life. Segregation of schools, of parks, of libraries, even drinking fountains and bathrooms. Um, and as we've studied, buses, trains, and restaurants were segregated. Very common to see whites only signs and colored signs. Just very constant reminders of the racial order that was established by these Jim Crow laws. So the American Civil Rights Movement was the overcoming of the Jim Crow laws, if you can follow that. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of resistance in the American South to the Civil Rights Movement. This would have been a picture from looks like the 1950s, maybe the early 1960s. The promotion of segregation in the American South. The flag, by the way, has since been banned in the States. And as I mentioned, very typical, separate drinking fountains, more segregation laws and signs. It's hard to believe, at least to me, it's hard to believe that that world existed. I mean, this wasn't that long ago. This was the 1960s. It's not like it's ancient histories. It's not that long ago in our past that was going on. A picture of Malcolm X, who was another, leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. Although he went a little further in some ways, and a lot of his actions became more violent and went beyond um, civil disobedience and nonviolence. A lot of his work laid the foundation for subsequent Black Power um, and more extreme movements in America. Okay, so that's our look at the American Civil Rights Movement. A very quick survey of what it was, where it came from. I wish we had more time and I could do more with it. That we don't have a lot of time to work with this spring. What we're going to do next is we're going to watch a video called "Free at Last" that kind of shows you the struggle of Black people getting their political rights and freedoms in the American South. It's about 40 minutes long. My recommendation is don't watch it all in one sitting. Maybe watch half today, watch half tomorrow. And as you watch, take notes. Pause it, periodically take notes. There will be a few dates in there that you really want to make note of. Perhaps the the March on Selma, you'd want to pause and take some information down on that. The Voter Rights Act, you'll want to pause, write down the date, take notes on that. You're gathering information, but you're also going to get some good visuals and anecdotals about the civil rights movement, and the story of it, and how it percolated into this big national movement by the end. You'll like it. I wish we could watch it in class and I could pause it with you and talk to you about it, but of course I can't. So make sure you're doing that. You're watching to gain information, to gather evidence, etc. Later on this week, we'll learn about women's liberation as another example of overcoming illiberalism. We'll examine eugenics in Canada and especially the Western provinces of further example. And we'll finish off by looking at the Indian Act as another example of an illiberal act by a democratic government. I hope you like the topic. I really like teaching illiberalism. I find it really interesting and fascinating. We'll spend the rest of the week on illiberalism and then move on to something else next week. Thanks for listening.